بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So, as a continuation of the last video that I made, where I discussed the relationship between Gaza and other fronts in the global war against Islam, the war between Islam and Kufr, I'm going to go into specifics a little more this time and talk specifically about the Sahelian Jihad. The Sahel is a region between the Sahara Desert and between what they call sub-Saharan Africa. This is a phrase invented by the Kuffar. But anyway, the more southern green areas of Africa with more precipitation. The modern chapter of this story starts when a collection of groups in northern Mali took control of northern Mali, an alliance of, some of them were more religious, some were more nationalist, and they took control of most of northern Mali, including the cities of Timbuktu, Gao. And they established Sharia, they established the Hudud, and the immediate response of the international community, meaning the West, is that they launched a military intervention. So mainly France, because Mali is a former colony of France, so it had strong relationships with the post-independence regime, which is not really independence, but that's another story. And so France sent a military intervention and did succeed in expelling the Muslims, the religious elements, from the cities. They fled to the countryside, as has happened in other Islamic insurgencies, such as Afghanistan. And an insurgency began, and it continued for 10 years. Even before I became Muslim, this is something that it had an impact on me specifically because of Germany sending medical aid. And this shifted the way that I thought about the medical system. Because I realized that medicine is not just about helping people, but it's also about power and influence and colonization. Because I thought, why would Germany send medical aid to their enemies, to a country which has rebelled against the international order, has established Sharia? And I realized that the motivation, it was partly to subdue the people, and that there were other countries that were more in need of medical aid, but they're sending the medical aid to a country that is fighting against liberalism as a governing principle. France, after 10 years, they were exhausted, and the regime was realizing that it's not working. The US is also there, by the way, providing support, especially drone strikes, surveillance, intelligence. But there were a series of coups in Mali and Niger and Burkina Faso, and all of these were influenced by the counterinsurgency efforts, and partly the failure of the counterinsurgency efforts. But this story is actually much older than just these recent events. Across this region, the region of the Sahel, there were a number of Islamic states established around 150 to 250 years ago. And Islam has been steadily expanding into this region for hundreds of years, actually. So in the northern part, Islam is established for a very, very long time. But over the centuries, Islam has been expanding into the more southern parts of Africa. So this is a continuous process of the growth of Islam. And the first major Islamic state that was established in the region was called the Sokoto Caliphate, Khilafah. But there were others, such as the Imamate of Futa Jalon, which is in modern-day Guinea, the Tukolor Empire, which is in the modern-day Mali. And all of these states generally followed Maliki fiqh, and they all ruled by Sharia, not always perfectly, sometimes to lesser or greater degrees, and they all waged jihad fi sabilillah against the mushrikeen. So the region actually has a very rich Islamic history. And Mali in particular it's not surprising that an Islamic insurgency would arise in Mali, because in the colonial era, the French set up their main base of operations in Senegal. And until today, other Africans in West Africa kind of view Senegalese as traitors or agents of the French. So a lot of Senegalese, or some of the Senegalese I talk to, are afraid to travel across West Africa because of the way that people might react to them. And even now that America and France have been expelled from Mali and Burkina Faso and Niger, they're moving towards Senegal as their main support in the war against the Muslims in the more interior areas. So this is a consistent pattern. And in the past, the way that the French established this base in West Africa is by expelling the more religious people, really the people who are on the Sunnah. They would expel them from Senegal and send them to remote desert areas in Mali, among other places, just when it was inconvenient to execute them for political reasons, but they needed to get rid of them. This was a place where they used in the same way that like Russia would use Siberia to expel their political prisoners. It makes sense why Senegal would become more westernized and more of an agent of the West, and that Mali would have a stronger Islamic, I guess, a dawah or Islamic identity or Islamic activism and jihad fi sabilillah. So continuing with the background of the situation here, after the Western powers, such as America and France, were expelled from these three states, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, Russia has been trying to take advantage of this power vacuum and move in, and they have made agreements with the states, not usually cash, but mostly for gold. They're taking like a percentage of the gold which is produced in the mines in these countries in exchange for providing training, equipment, and mercenaries, fighters, to fight against the Islamic insurgencies in this region. So the Muslims in this area, they're up against both the Russians, who are actively working with these regimes, and then they also are fighting the regimes which are still aligned with the West, which are the other ECOWAS countries. ECOWAS is an economic union of West Africa, the economic community of West African states. So now that Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are no longer cooperating with the Western Bloc, the rest of ECOWAS has kind of turned against them, and the West is increasing its relationships with countries like Ghana, Senegal, Togo, Benin, other countries in the region which are closer to the coast. And this is consistent with the pattern of Western colonialism in Africa for a long time, which is that it has been mainly a maritime phenomenon. Western powers mainly exercised their colonial control through port cities, cities which were on the coast, or cities which were located on major rivers where you could move materials or people, personnel, to the coast. European colonialism in general has always been a ship-based colonialism. And this dimension of the conflict between the West and Russia is also not new. This goes back to the Soviet Union. There were many scholarships granted to Africans from this region to go and study in the Soviet Union. There were some regimes which were socialist regimes which were supported by the Soviet Union. And Burkina Faso is one of the most famous examples. Thomas Sankara was a famous reformer. He was a president of Burkina Faso before it was called Upper Volta by the French. But he changed the name to Burkina Faso to emphasize the African identity. He was a pan-Africanist and an anti-colonial activist. And he rejected IMF loans, which of course IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is an organization or an institution for projecting Western influence. But he was ultimately assassinated, and his successor did take loans from the IMF and was cooperative with them. The point is that there is this tradition of anti-colonial sentiment in the region also. You have the Islamic tradition and the push for jihad and Sharia, and you also have the influence of the communist bloc and the Russians. These are both working to expel the French and the US in the region. And there's some real logic to this too, because the governments in these countries have realized that being backed by the West and having direct military cooperation with them undermines their legitimacy. It makes them look like Western puppets, and it supports the argument by the Muslims, the Mujahideen, that these are murtadeen, that they're apostate puppets of the kuffar. But at the same time, the states, they can't live on their own because these are artificial states. These are not states that developed over hundreds of years like the states of Europe, where the national identity was programmed into the people through multiple wars and homogenization of the language and culture and public education programs. Rather, these countries were haphazardly created without a lot of attention to the actual ethnic landscape of the region. They were designed more with Western interests in mind. The point is that these states are extremely weak and fragile and prone to failure in all of their governmental institutions. So they absolutely depend on external support from a power that does have an established national identity, that does have functional institutions and economy. So the point is that it's not really an option for these regimes to have any kind of real independence. They can only survive with the support of outside powers. Of course, as in many cases throughout history, in the margins or the cracks, the fissures in the global order that appear in the geopolitical rivalry between major powers, opportunities appear. There are power vacuums that appear, and Muslims are able to enter into these power vacuums and build military force and economic strength and build up Islamic governance. Now, these insurgencies have been growing a lot in the past years. They've gotten much stronger, they've gotten much more active. So the question is then, why would the US and France accept to leave the region when this is a burgeoning, growing threat? And one reason is that it's not that geopolitically significant. It's not very strategic geography. The main natural resources are gold and uranium, but there are plenty of other sources of these, so the West doesn't really need them. It's not critical. And the West thinks of it as a kind of a quagmire that they were stuck in. So letting Russia take over there is kind of appealing from their perspective. It's really difficult terrain. The climate is harsh. These supply lines, it's expensive to get supplies there because a lot of stuff has to be airlifted in. So for the West, it just makes sense to let Russia move in there and let them get drained instead of the West being drained. But the result is that the Muslims are going to get even stronger because Russia is much less capable at counterinsurgency than the West is. They can do it. They can do it, but they have a very different strategy. So these states with less resources, they tend to use more violent or more harmful counterinsurgency strategies. I compare this sometimes to the difference between broad spectrum antibiotics and more targeted antibiotics or surgery or something like that. Because high level advanced antibiotics, they do a lot less collateral damage to the body, but they target the actual whatever bacteria that the doctors or whoever are trying to kill. But the broad spectrum antibiotics, they work also, but they just damage a lot of other stuff. So those are the strategies that lower income powers tend to use in fighting counterinsurgency. And it works in the short term, but in the long term, it tends to push a lot more people towards the insurgency because they make a lot of grievances and they make the people end up hating the counterinsurgent power. So the West's perspective at this point is to kind of retreat, move away from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, and they're going to set up bases instead in Ghana and Senegal and the more coastal countries where the supply lines are easier, the conditions are less harsh, And they're going to let the Russians move into this vacuum and get drained in this way. And they're going to set up bases at the same time with drones. They're going to be training these Christian militaries on the coast because, again, the percentage of Muslims in Burkina Faso and Mali and Nigeria is much higher. So that's also a hazard. The Muslims are there's more challenges that come with that than working with Christians who are from generally the same religious background as the West, as the French and the US. And they're going to pursue a strategy of containment. So maybe at this point, they don't even want to eliminate the Islamic insurgencies because Russia has taken over them. So it's in their interest to kind of back off and let the Islamic insurgencies get stronger and more effectively drain Russia. But at the same time, they don't want them to expand into these Christian countries that they're getting resources from. So at this point, the West is hardly getting any significant resources from these three countries, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and Mali. But they still are getting lots of important resources from these other states in West Africa. And the Islamic groups that are fighting in West Africa have already started doing raids into these other countries, such as Ghana and Togo and these more predominantly Christian states. So the West is going to be more concerned with preserving these states. And we have to consider this in the context of the war with Ukraine, too, because Russia is under a lot of strain with the war in Ukraine. And this is going to strain all of their military missions in Africa, too. And although the West doesn't show it, what Russia is doing, it is having a major impact on economies within the international liberal order. And a catastrophic failure of the Western economy, I do believe it's inevitable. I don't know. It could be 50 years, it could be 20 years, it could be 5 years, Allahu Alam. But I do believe it's inevitable. So there is potential of both weakening or total collapse of the Russian or the Western neo-colonial missions in West Africa. And as the Islamic insurgencies are gaining power in these regions, they are positioned to capitalize very quickly and very effectively on any such collapse when it happens. To better understand this situation, it's also important to understand the geography and the climate, what's happening with the climate in this region. So the desert is expanding, the earth is getting hotter. We could argue about why it's getting hotter, if it has to do with human beings or if it's just the will of Allah. I don't care personally, but the earth is getting hotter and you cannot deny this. The weather patterns worldwide are getting more intense. There is more flooding, there are more droughts. And so the desert is expanding, and that is putting pressure on the populations that live in these regions, many of which are pastoral livestock herders, especially the Fulani tribe. And the Fulani make up the biggest part of the Islamic insurgencies. The Fulani are actually genetically more closely related to Arabs than other tribes in the region. And they also were the founders and important leaders in the jihadi states which were established in the region prior to European colonization. And the Fulani are a tribe that stretches from Sudan all the way to Senegal. And this region is all kind of open. There are no major geographical barriers which keep the people from traveling. So these borders really don't make any sense in this region. And the same thing kind of applies in the case of Ukraine, the steppe of the Eurasian continent. None of the borders there really make sense. This is a region where herders and nomadic tribes have always roamed freely from the east to the west, depending on the seasons and where food was available for their animals and so on and so forth. So when you see the Islamic groups fighting in this region, you see they're usually doing offensives on motorcycle, and you can drive on motorcycle more or less from Senegal to Sudan in a straight line over flat terrain. It's also relevant to mention when we're talking about the Sahel, about the jihad in Nigeria, and there's been quite strong Islamic insurgency also in Nigeria. In northeast Nigeria, there's a group called Liwat al-Sunnah lil-Jihad wa Da'wah, and this group gave bay'ah to the Dawla Islamiyya, the Islamic State group, but then it split into a faction which is bit more extreme in takfir, and they've been fighting each other, but they've also been fighting the Nigerian government continuously. And in the northwest of Nigeria, there's a group that goes by the name of Ansaru, or it's called commonly Ansaru. It's smaller and less active, but it has a significant presence. They have taken control of some towns. And the northwest in general is controlled, northwest of Nigeria is controlled by bandits. The central government doesn't have a lot of control. Some of these bandits, they reach the level of being warlords, really. There's already good indications that there are links between the jihadi groups in Nigeria and those in the Sahel. And as the governance and security continues to degrade in the region, it's likely that those groups are going to link up and probably eventually unify into just a single organization. So this is just some of the general analysis. But what does this actually mean for the Muslims? Da'wah is very important for jihad. This is the beginning, really. We need awareness of our obligations in the religion, and we need awareness of the overall situation, the reality. And this is always the case with any fiqh, with any ijtihad, that you must understand the Sharia and you must understand the reality in which you are going to apply the Shari'i ahkam. Now, an example of Tunisia, for example. Tunisia was a very secular state where Islam was suppressed for a long time, and they were also one of the biggest contributors to the jihad in Syria. Thousands of recruits from Tunisia, they traveled to Syria, they fought against Bashar al-Assad. And maybe that's another installment of this series that I can do, is the benefits that this jihad in Syria had. There was a lot of hardship with it, but it had a lot of geopolitical impact, which is, it brings a lot of blessings in da'wah and in amr bil ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar, and joining the good and forbidding the evil. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya, there was active jihadi da'wah in all of these countries for past years. And when they realize the truth and they realize the meaning of Islam and the importance of jihad within Islam, and they realize the importance of implementing the knowledge and not just continuously studying until death, then they want to, and then when they realize the fadail, the reward and the benefits of jihad fi sabilillah, then they're going to want to go to jihad. Anybody who is sincere in their heart. And like Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, whoever dies without participating in a battle or having had the sincere intention to participate in a battle dies on a branch of hypocrisy. All of these countries in North Africa, there is a clear path, again, through the Sahara. It is difficult to cross the Sahara, but it's very feasible. There are smugglers going across, and there's legitimate traffic going across. It's a few days of driving. Maybe, really, you can do it in 2 days if you don't get hung up on the border security too much. 2 days you can drive across the Sahara and join these groups. So all of this jihadi da'wah, which has been going on in North Africa, now there's an outlet for it. All of the Muslims who have sincerity in their hearts and they want to act upon their knowledge, they have somewhere that they can go and that they can act upon this. Whereas in North Africa, it's so tightly controlled, the security presence, they're all getting money from Europe and the West, and they have intelligence from Europe and the West, and assistance from Europe and the West to control everything there. It's very just suffocating for anyone who's trying to start any kind of a jihadi movement or any movement to establish Sharia. And this also provides an outlet for a lot of the weapons. So, for example, when the West removed the Libyan government, they pumped a huge amount of weapons into Libya. And these weapons have been smuggled out and they've been fueling these insurgencies in Africa. And the border regions are huge and very difficult to monitor. So it's quite possible for Muslims to get across these borders without being noticed by the European-backed security forces. This is clearly the beginning of an Islamic State. They already established an Islamic State. They were knocked out by the French. Now they're struggling with the Russians. So they haven't really been able to establish a state. But as I mentioned, with the pressure that is on both the liberal international order and on Russia, there is real potential for collapse, which will enable the formation of a real Islamic State. There's no shortage of recruits in these regions. So if an Islamic State raises in this region, it's going to be able to raid a lot of countries. Again, this is a huge region. So the West is concentrating their resources, their military resources, in Ghana and in Senegal especially. But there are all kinds of other states. It's a huge area, so they're not going to be able to cover everything. And there's lots of potential for hit and run raids, which can help to finance and fund the state. And this is really, I believe that every true Islamic state in history, that ghanima has been core to its economic viability. One of the reasons for the failure of all modern Islamic State projects is that they have not had jihad as a fundamental sector of their economy and a fundamental source of resources for keeping the state running. And what happens when you don't have ghanima to finance your state is that you start turning towards taxes. And taxes make the population hate you, and they also cripple the economy. The West, they established their institutional models through heavy taxation, but it was gradual taxation. They built it up over hundreds of years. And they also supplemented it with colonial plunder so that they could pacify the people by giving them lots of benefits and things like that, which is why it's absolutely impossible to imitate the Western model of development, especially in a short period of time. Now, it's very unlikely that West Africa will ever be a base for targeting the West, like Syria, because Syria, Sham in general, is much closer to Europe. It's much easier to travel to Europe undetected from Sham. And this is one of the reasons why there is more military pressure on the Sham, because it is a bigger threat. But again, this is not necessarily such a big problem because it means there's going to be less pressure, which means there's going to be more space for establishing real Islamic governance. The real strategic relevance of an Islamic state in the Sahel would be as a rear base for Islamic insurgencies in more important areas. For example, in the civil war in Libya, both Al-Qaeda and the Dawla Islamiyya group were controlling territories. Dawla was controlling Sirta, the city of Sirta, and Qaeda was controlling Derna, which is in the east. And they were both wiped out by American-backed forces, which were able to surround them, encircle them, and deplete them. And this has been key. If you look at every American counterinsurgency effort, that's the first thing they try to do is contain the movement to make sure that they cut off their supply lines of recruits and of materials. So they cut them off in terms of their human wealth and their economic wealth. And then they try to divide it and cut it into pieces and break it down one by one, sector by sector, just eliminate everyone. And this was also the case in the Algerian Civil War. In the Algerian Civil War, there was a government which was elected, and they were talking about sending 1 million soldiers to Palestine. And of course, this government was removed in a coup. The democratically elected government was removed, and insurgency grew up in response to this, and it was very, very close to taking over the capital and taking over the country. But it was actually infiltrating the Islamic groups with extreme takfir and isolating them from the local population. It made it a lot easier to deplete them. But that's within the national context of Algeria. So imagine if there was an Islamic insurgency, which could not be ideologically isolated, which means it could not be cut off from supporters just by turning frankly, this is the reality, the simple-minded people with media narratives, with fake operations, where you have people with fake beards going and massacring whole villages, and then you have nobody to explain the kind of media war which is going on to the common people, and the common people just think, oh no, these Islamists are insane extremists, and we have to side with the government against them because they're not really implementing Islam. If you have like a territory with hundreds of millions of potential recruits where there is not ideological control and media manipulation possible as it is happening with the North African populations now. They just get programmed to the media to think that any Islamic insurgency are just crazy extremists who want to kill everybody and they don't know anything about Islam. So, but the point is that if there are Islamic insurgencies in North Africa, that they have backing from a big population and a big economic power base that is not susceptible to these propaganda campaigns, then they can just, they can move in personnel and resources continuously. And again, trying to control the movement of people and persons across the Sahara is a very, very, very difficult task. So the wars that have happened between Muslim mujahideen working to establish Sharia in places like Libya and Algeria, and to some extent we could even say political Islamists like the Ikhwan in Egypt, they largely failed due to their isolation. So a large Islamic state, even if it's not wealthy by Western standards or something like that, it just needs to provide enough in terms of recruits and materials to keep these insurgencies alive. And so if insurgencies happen again in this region, and there is a friendly support base nearby, it's going to completely change the dynamic. And this has implications for Sudan also, where you also have a situation where there's two very not Islamic groups fighting a war each other and draining each other. So you have in Chad, in the Islamic groups in northeast Nigeria are already present in Chad. And Chad is currently the support base for the UAE, the Emirati-backed faction, which is fighting in Sudan, the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. The RSF are also backed by Haftar and the Libyan National Army, and those are also backed by UAE. So that's kind of the UAE nexus or block in really Central and North Africa. And the LNA, Haftar, are already conducting counterterrorism training exercises in Ghana because they realize that this war is coming and they're getting ready. They're going to be one of the proxies of both the West and Emirat, the UAE in Africa. But again, in Sudan, with the Sudanese government and the UAE-backed faction fighting and draining each other, this will weaken them both. And there's already close to being direct contact between the Islamic groups in Chad and the UAE-backed militias. So the point is there are all of these different conflicts happening at the same time, which can facilitate and support and open up space for Islamic groups to establish governance. You have the conflict between Russia and the West. You have the conflict between UAE and the Sudanese government. You have the conflict between the ECOWAS states of like Senegal and Ghana and Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. All of these conflicts are going to be draining all of these parties, which are fighting the Islamic groups at the same time. And unfortunately for the akhira of the Turks are also getting involved in this. The Turks, they have now their colony in Libya, which is Western Libya. And there's the rivalry between Turkey and UAE happening in Libya. But that also has implications because Libya is, of course, bordering Niger. And it's helpful to know that Algeria is also backing the Turkish-backed faction in Libya, and Morocco is backing the UAE-backed faction. So there's also the potential for escalation between Algeria and Morocco, which of course that would also weaken them and that would also be beneficial for the Muslims, bi-idhnillah ta'ala. So this is going on a bit long. I apologize, and may Allah reward those who have the patience to listen to all of this. I hope seeking understanding so that we can be slaves of Allah in His path. Before I close, I want to talk about the economic dimension of this, and especially the role of slavery. A lot of people wonder why I talk about slavery. This is not just, a lot of brothers, they talk about slavery because it's just some kind of a sexual fantasy about them, but it has important implications for the economic viability of Islamic governmental projects, because technology is It's core to the liberal vision of government, but it requires integration into the international liberal order. And slavery is an alternative economic model. Now, Europeans, they want to sell their machines, of course, so they have always been very active in trying to eradicate and ban slavery to force everyone to buy their machines. But this region is perfect for slave economies because you have an really effectively endless supply of slaves from countries like, from mushrikeen. We're not talking about Muslim mushrikeen and Christians in the Congo Basin, in Nigeria, all over West Africa. So slaves can be used for a lot of things like manufacturing textiles, for mining, they're very appropriate, metallurgy, even smithing and weapons manufacturing, irrigating crops. So if you can't afford pumps or you don't have access to pumps, you can have slaves do it by hand. Building infrastructure like roads, defensive barriers and things like that, trenches. The region is also very rich in gold, so the slaves can mine gold. And this can also help to reduce the use of dollars, which will weaken the American economic empire because it depends on demand for dollars. So there is the potential here for an autonomous, slave-driven economy, which is independent of global trade networks. And it's very difficult for the West to intervene and do anything about this because it's landlocked and the West depends on naval power so much. The spaces are huge, so even if you want to monitor it all with drones, there's so much territory to cover that you're going to spend a fortune, a huge amount of money, just trying to cover this territory with drones and the fuel of deploying them and getting to the target and back, especially when the bases are further away, like in southern Ghana and places like that. And the raids if there's an Islamic state in the Sahel, the raids could also disrupt economies by destabilizing the Christian countries in West Africa. Now, the most important economy in the region is by far Nigeria. And Nigeria also already has one of the biggest insurgencies in the region. Now, when the Nigerian insurgencies start getting support from the Sahel, it's going to be like a multiplier of their strength because they're going to start getting recruits and materials and they can just move them back and forth at will. And if they can disrupt the oil exports from Nigeria or tap into them, there's a big source of revenue. And it can also drive up energy prices worldwide, which will put political pressure all over the place in terms of employment. It'll put deflationary pressure on economies around the world. And Russia is already working really hard to do this. So that could get the West a little bit closer to their breaking point and their Berlin Wall moment, which I hope we're all waiting for. Every sincere Muslim is waiting for anxiously, that there will be a Berlin Wall moment where the decline of Western hegemony becomes apparent. And another issue that, of course, will cause civil unrest is that when energy prices go up, food prices go up, because when fuel prices go up, they start using more ethanol, which is produced from grains, to fuel vehicles and ships and whatnot. And, of course, instability in this region will also put more pressure on Europe, and it will start draining Europe economically because a lot of the migrant routes, everybody in Europe is very worried about African immigrants working illegally and committing crimes and whatever, generally causing chaos, changing the cultural landscape of the country, which a lot of people are really unhappy about, watching their national identities die, watching their cultural and ethnic identities die. So this is fueling the rise of the far right parties, anti-immigration parties. So they're already paying a lot of money to North African states to control migration. But if there are now military skirmishes across the Sahara happening, and there's a precedent of using immigration as a weapon against Europe. Gaddafi, most notably, when the West started bombing him, he was accepted money to hold all of these immigrants. And when they started bombing, he said, "Okay, I'm letting them all go," and he started sending hundreds of ships of immigrants to Europe just to strike back at them. So facilitating the move of immigrants through this region is definitely a way to destabilize Europe and to drain resources from Europe, which will get more involved in the region in trying to stop the flow of immigrants. And most likely the West will not take this lying down. They're not going to just let this happen. There's going to be more proxy wars. There's going to be more direct interventions. But what is happening is that we're seeing the proxy wars and the direct interventions getting pushed back So Afghanistan is an example. Now they've transitioned in Afghanistan from direct occupation to trying to use political influence and manipulation to control and exercise influence over the region. But they've lost influence. Their influence is weaker, and they're backing up. So when interventions happen in the future, this is the same of what's happening in Africa. And the interventions in the future, they're getting pushed closer towards Europe. So the next proxy wars are more likely to be happening in North Africa and in the coastal states of West Africa. So what we're actually seeing is that the West is retreating, that they're getting pushed back, and that Muslims are filling the gap into here. Now, I don't think a lot of Muslims are even aware of this, of what's going on. There's a lot of focus on Gaza, but there's not a lot of understanding of what the relationship between Gaza and this is. Yeah, and of course, as I've said very controversially recently, Egypt is frankly the key. And I have more hope that there could be an organized Islamic force. Now, this is also kind of controversial, and I don't see this as a bad thing, but Africans generally do have lower intelligence than North Africans. This is just a fact, and I think that's an advantage in many cases because they're not as susceptible to colonization and mental colonization, and that's why this is happening in West Africa. So may Allah bless them. But we can be honest about we have our different strengths. Africans have superior physical strength and endurance. This is why they succeed in sports so much. So, but if we have these recruits coming from North Africa and from the West and from other regions and migrating to Africa, and then we have the strong manpower, then you can get a capable and organized mixed ethnicity military force. And that's, I believe, one of the strengths of the American military also, is that it is very egalitarian and it's a very mixed ethnicity. There's a high proportion of Africans, people of African heritage in the American military, but there are also other ethnicities of Latin American, like Mexican background and European background. Of course, there are Africans with higher intelligence than the vast majority of people of European or Asian ethnicity, and they, in a truly egalitarian and this would be the case in a truly Islamic military, it's a true meritocracy. So there's no barrier to somebody who has exceptionally high intelligence rising to the highest levels of the organization, despite their ethnicity and the average intelligence of their ethnicity. So you get a very robust mixed ethnicity officer corps too, with access to just more diverse human resources. And in terms of religion, this is a almost exclusively Sunni region. North Africa and West Africa are all Sunni, and they're also almost all united in the Maliki madhab. So you have a very high degree of religious uniformity. So that makes it a lot easier to make a big unified state. And it's also surrounded only by disbelievers. So in Turkey or Iraq and Sham, for example, you have these endless debates going on where you have people saying, no, these Kemalists, they're kuffar, these secularists, we can't consider them Muslims, we can't ally with them. And then others say, no, they're Muslims, they testify La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, and we can ally with them. And then, there's all this backstabbing that goes on and all these alliances with the West that are happening. And then you have the Shia on the other hand. Some people, no, we need to have Hamas saying we have to ally with the Shia, they're the lesser evil. Then you have people arguing, no, the Shia are actually Muslims. And you have people saying the Shia are not Muslims. They have some Islamic elements, but no. But none of that is an issue in West Africa. You've got everybody's Sunni Maliki, and they're surrounded by clear mushrikeen and clear Christians, and there's no doubt about the kufr of these. So that makes it a lot easier to unify the ranks. And a lot of Muslims currently, they put their hopes in Turkey because Turkey they built up this Western style technological economy, and they did this by completely abandoning Islam, by completely embracing feminism, by completely embracing total alliances, which are absolute clear kufr by ijma' with the kuffar. And if they start to try to go in an Islamic direction with this technology, this is why I believe this hope is misplaced. If they try to go in a real Islamic direction, then all of the links and all of the kufr that they've built their technology on is going to start undermining their technological production, which means they're going to get cut off and they're going to get worn down in a war of attrition, and they're not going to make significant progress, even if they ever do go to war with the West. And any movement that occurs in the West, and as people who know me know, I do believe that Iran is left alone to some extent by the West and the Jews. They let it get stronger because they know that any time any kind of Sunni power starts to rise, that the Shia will pounce on it, they will jump on it and fight it. And that's exactly what happened in Syria. It was the Shia, they were the foot soldiers that prevented any kind of a state rising, which would actually truly threaten Israel and threaten the West. So this is a massive, massive war that needs to happen before the Muslims in Iraq and Sham, or in Turkey in general, before they can really confront the West and take down the West. They have to take down the Shia crescent, or the networks of Shia that are happening there. And that also applies in the Arabian Peninsula. Anything that happens in the Arabian Peninsula, they're going to have to deal with the Houthis, who are an Iranian proxy. And this is one of the strategic divergences between the Dawla Islamiyya, the Islamic State group, and other groups, is the question of focusing on the Shia first. And I have to agree, frankly, that you do have to confront the Shia in those regions. It makes sense in Iraq especially, which is where that group is from. And that's another, maybe I'll do another episode or installment on that issue, the differences in strategic differences between Hamas, between Al-Qaeda, and between Islamic State. But that's why I don't believe that there will be any real hope for Palestine, certainly, from that direction, from the direction of Sham or Iraq, until there is a decisive defeat or reduction in power and influence of Iran and its proxies, which of course are closely allied with Russia. So I will conclude by saying that the Sahelian Jihad in general, is getting far too little attention from the Muslims, and this is a reflection of the general problem of, I don't know if I want to call it racism or discrimination against Africans, against our Muslim brothers from Africa. But we need to be paying attention to what they're doing, because they are fighting the same struggle as the brothers in Palestine, as the brothers in Iraq and Sham. They are fighting against the Russian Empire, and they're fighting against the West and against states which are directly feeding the West in West Africa. So their success is our success. The success of the brothers in Africa is the success of the brothers in Sham and everywhere else. So we need to pay attention to them. We need to support them in whatever ways possible in the path of Allah, hoping for the reward which Allah and His Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam promised for those who supported mujahideen in the path of Allah. And we need to be making dua for them. We need to be morally supporting them. We need to be proud of them. We need to be proud of their successes, and we need to be sad when they face difficulties. And it should inspire us to make dua and take action, just as if it was our own family who was fighting the wars there, fighting a war which is for the sake of our religion, and which is for the sake of the well-being and the strength and the honor of our ummah. Yeah, that's the introduction to the Sahelian Jihad. So I hope that you have benefited from this, and may Allah make these words a source of guidance to those who listen, and may Allah protect the listeners from any misguidance, from the mistakes that I have made and the mistakes which Shaitan has caused me to make. And if there are any other questions or comments, please feel free to leave in the comments any discussion or any requests for future installments of this series. Barakallahu feekum. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in.